Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. With me for this program are James and Deborah Fallows, the husband-wife co-author duo of the critically acclaimed and best-selling book, Our Town's 100,000-Mile Journey into the Heart of America. I had the chance to review Our Towns for the Erie Reader and bluntly put it's a must-read. A link to that review is going to be available in the comment section below. The list of their accomplishments stretches nearly as many miles as they've traveled for that best-selling book, but it is worth noting that both are contributors to The Atlantic and have been for quite some time, but they both also contributed to a host of other publications. Amongst her many accomplishments, Deborah is a fellow at New America and is the author of Dreaming in Chinese, Mandarin Lessons in Life, Love, and Language, and holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Austin at Texas. Amongst his many accomplishments, James worked as President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter and has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and as a fellow of the American Geographical Society and is the author of a dozen other books. For more on both of them, I'd encourage you to visit ourtownsbook.com. Together, we're going to discuss the towns and cities they've visited throughout their multi-year journey, including Erie, Pennsylvania, and to learn about their travels and reporting since. No strangers to Erie, the Fallows presented at Global Summit 10 and were honored with the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award and received keys to the city from Erie Mayor Joe Schember. I had the chance to interview the Fallows prior to that Global Summit appearance, and a link to that will also be available in the comments section. We'll discuss how the Fallows are observing local responses in the wake of COVID-19 to examine how regions can learn from each other and so much more. We're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it below in the comment section and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Deb and Jim, welcome back to the Jefferson.
And thank you so much. It's great to be back home.
Really there.
We wish we were really there too. And it's such an interesting and trying time. And I'm sure we're going to unpack a lot of that. Speaking of being there, one of the things that I want to note before we get into the deeper questions is that actually my virtual background is a photo that the two of you took on one of your first trips to Erie to cover us in the Atlantic. So we are grateful for that. I see you two are operating out of the home studios, safe and sound and in Washington, D.C.
We are. Yep. Jim is upstairs. I am downstairs. He's got a fancy studio rigged area. I am like in a closet.
But you have picturesque, murals from our time in China behind you.
Sure.
I have a bunch of books, and I'm looking out on the backyard where we see increasing herds of deer. We live about 3.5 miles from the White House, and the wildlife is just taking over here in the absence of people. There are herds of deer, there are squirrels by the gazillion. That just, you feel as if nature is getting its chance again.
All right, so folks, we're back. I apologize for that interruption. We're all learning new technology. This is all a new time for us. So hopefully everybody who was able to see the start of that first video can jump over here to our second one and catch back up. Don't want to belabor what we've gone through already. I have a great intro on both Jim and Deb, which are absolutely deserving to be read. We'll go ahead and put that in the comment section because you want to hear from them and not from me. So we do want to talk about that. And we were just talking about nature and the reemergence of nature in the COVID times. And I had shared with them after they told me some of the things running around in their backyards that I had a turkey in mine the other day. So we are certainly noticing different times. With COVID, I've got to ask a couple of just quick questions. Have either of you cut your own hair or each other's hair yet? Have you gotten to that point?
Okay, take a look. What do you think?
I think you both look fantastic.
And I just took a shower precisely so my hair would be matted down. I don't know if any of your listeners or viewers are old enough to recall the Nick Nolte mugshot from 15 or 20 years ago. That's sort of the look I'm going for with my hair pretty soon, because I needed a haircut 6 weeks ago and it's been 6 weeks.
Well, you both look fantastic, and I know that's one of the first things I'm going to be doing. I had foolishly decided to let my beard grow out a little bit before all of this, and so now it's even longer. I'm not sure how much longer it's going to stay, especially with headed out in the public with some face masks. I know it's not the safest thing, but
But it looks great. You look great.
I appreciate that. So before we get into other questions too, I've just got to ask, what's your go-to quarantine food, your snack food at this point? What do you both turn into in your pantries and cabinets?
Okay, I know. Popcorn. That's not a very inspiring. I mean, I'm trying to keep away from the cookies. So popcorn and apples and cheese. What else, Jim?
So I am not, through my long history, I'm not a tea drinker, but I find myself drinking this ginger tea all day long as a way to be hydrated and not just to start drinking beer at 10 a.m. So those are the two virtues of drinking tea.
And good virtues they are. And I do want to come back to some other just COVID-19 curiosities, including beer, wine, liquor, or the first meal you've remade, favorite takeout carryaway. We'll come back to those, but it's been 17 months since you were last in Erie for the Jefferson's Global Summit 10. Looking back, tell us a little bit about the highlights of what you've been up to since.
Deb, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we've had a really busy last year and a half, actually. We've had the great good fortune to be filming a movie, a documentary based on our book with HBO. So we've been back out on the road to a number of the towns where we were first reporting with this HBO team. And it has been a really interesting experience because we've, come to appreciate the many places and people and stories, but through an entirely different medium, trying to understand what you do as a film director, as opposed to as a reporter. Some things are easier, some things are harder. What's different is that we finally understand that this is all about action shots. We can take as long as we want to interview people and so forth and leave a lot on the edit room floor. But when you're in there filming, it's all about showing action really quickly. So we've been on the road for about 18 months with HBO, filming in half a dozen of the cities that we went to for our original reporting. And we have learned so much about the difference of making a documentary, which is based on this book, as opposed to hoofing it around as journalists on the street. On the one hand, it's really easier to do it just as a regular person with your little reporter's notebook and not being at all intimidating. And cameras and microphones, which are pretty intimidating, although I must say the HBO team is fantastic at putting people at their ease. So that has been a real learning experience. We were a little scared going into a number of these towns, wondering, gosh, is this going to hold up? Will small businesses still be in business? Doors still being open? Has anybody going on? So it's also really gratifying because the stories actually have held up, and seeing it through the eyes of lots of action, lots of very much unseen, all talking with the players. We are kind of in and out of the background of this and helping stitch it together, but it's been really exciting to tell this whole story through a team is fantastic.
So Jim, give us a little bit about your experience, what it's been like for you. And I want to remind viewers, I know it's been a while, but I believe you won an Emmy at one point for an adaptation of a book. So you it's going into this, but what has this been like?
The Emmy front, there's the Emmys we all know about and watch on TV, and then there are the other Emmys that are for news documentaries and things like that. So I was in the sort of other Emmy for something I did about 15 years ago, an action hero and his crew called Doing This Living. That was a different kind of project than this one with HBO. And I'll just, in addition to what Deb was saying, we've seen that it is really beautiful, and we're so eager for people to see it. And we've been course, working on this in the past couple of years before the current pandemic, and we watched it again recently, just a week or so ago, and thought, what would we have to change? And the answer was almost nothing, because it was about the ways in which people and communities and cities and industries dealt with disruption, which is obviously happening in a unprecedented way right now. But we were talking about other disruptions. I guess the other thing that has happened since we were last at the Jefferson 18 months ago and had our proud moment of the Hagan Award and becoming honorary citizens of Erie was thinking more about Erie itself and also other cities. We've been to a lot of other places which are sort of in the same drama as Erie. We've been in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and Pensacola, Florida, and 15 others in the list that very much like people in Erie are dealing with the challenges of an older economic base that is and newer economic and civic organizations that are rising up. And I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I was doing a piece for The Atlantic about the report that you, Ben, and Bruce Katz had done on Erie's downtown, I think I was arguing there, we've come to think of Erie as, in a way, the representative American city of this moment, of being on the cusp of an older economy and a newer economy, and incorporating people from around the world and different generations and dealing with inequalities of all sorts. So Erie has loomed larger and larger in our minds it's only been less than 4 years since we were first there for Deb to speak at the Jefferson.
And Jim, a big thanks to you for writing about the report. We'll share a link in the comment section below for this video for to read. On The Atlantic, the report that Bruce Katz and I had a chance proxy for the nation, and I think that's one of the things that you two have done, so incredibly well, even to the point that saw a slight Twitter spat between Sioux Falls and Erie over Tom Hanks, who said he read your book and must go to Sioux Falls. What about Erie too?
Yes, it's true. And so, Deb, you've been in, Sioux Falls is in the news right now. Deb, why don't you talk about Jackson, Sioux Falls, right, just this week?
Yeah, so of course Sioux Falls is the home of the famous Smithfield pork processing plant, which has been shut down because of all the cases of COVID-19. And I've been talking with some of my contacts both in the school system and in the refugee community about, hey, how are things going there? Of course, they're not really going very well because they have a huge crisis on their hands. And I must say they've had double whammies. They had a huge floods and incredible storms that wreaked havoc on their farmers. And then they had tornadoes go through. And so it has been an extraordinarily bad luck year for Sioux Falls. On the other hand, we've seen them really come together as a community. In the school system, they completely pivoted, especially to take care of the kids who were in the most need, children of families where the parents were working in the plant and they're now laid off, or, well, they have a couple weeks of not working, but so many of them are sick, so that the kids are in charge. The kids are home trying to take care of their families. And the school system has moved, like most of them, to online teaching, remote teaching. But they've had to both be extremely accommodating for the kids in those families. 10% of the kids in Sioux Falls school systems are refugees and immigrants. And they've also, a lot of those kids have been hired by the local chains, which need grocery store, all in this together. First, you help take care of your families, then we'll work out the education bit. There's a lot of small town type coalition going among the healthcare systems. Fortunately, they have 2 big health systems in Erie who are stretching to take
Sioux Falls,
who are stretching to take care of all of these people. And it's just really heartening to see the spirit of the place coming together to be accommodating in more than just their own silos of interest.
And Deb, one of the other, and you have a great write up about this, online as you continue to track the locations. Another place that you talk about is Maine, and you talk about the response there with the healthcare system. And so, can you give us a little bit of insight what you're seeing there, because that's such a remote, rural part of Maine, and a great chapter of the book, by the way. Love your focus on them. But can you tell us a bit about the Roland B. French Medical Center and what that meant for Eastport, Maine?
Yes, so Eastport, Maine is a town of about 1,400 people, and there's a very long-standing medical center there. One of the advantages of being in a remote and underserved place, as much as Eastport is that they've qualified to be what's called a federally qualified health center. There are about 1,400 of these around the country. And it means that they get a lot of help from the government in a whole bunch of different ways. And one of the ways, believe it or not, that they get help from the government is that they have to be self-ready for things to happen, like Ebola outbreaks or pandemics. So believe it or not, this healthcare center was equipped with PPEs, with masks, with procedures to follow as being part of this healthcare system, to know exactly what they were supposed to do in the worst of circumstances, which has actually, of course, befallen them. So they're much, it's much easier in a way for them to pivot and say, okay, here are the 6 rules we need to follow. Here are the procedures we need to follow. And we are equipped with all of this stuff that everybody else is scrambling to find, like the PPEs and the masks. It hasn't all been perfect because being such a remote, people are really independent. They're like about this, and they were not necessarily embracing the dangers and the risks involved in it. So they didn't understand that they couldn't just go up to the healthcare clinic and have their usual appointments. So there was a lot of scrambling and public education and just kind of soothing of the processes and shifting things to doing telehealth and things online is also an issue. While they were ready to do that, in effect, not all of the patients in that remote area are ready to receive that kind of information. Internet is spotty. People don't have laptops at home. Even they can't connect to the proper procedures for doing telehealth, and they're not familiar with the operations. So while the infrastructure was there was on the street, in reality, a big learning curve to get it actually going and functioning.
Well, one of the things that I think has to be critical there, and maybe this speaks to those in Eastport, Maine getting it right, is leadership and being able to steer through crises and what that looks like. And, back to Sioux Falls for a minute. Jim, maybe you want to talk about, what the leadership looks like on a local level, and then maybe what it looks like on a state level, and how mayors are working with governors and governors are working with mayors, or perhaps maybe how it's not working.
So, Ben, thanks very much for asking that, because I did want to discuss it. So it is a sort of trait of contemporary discussion of politics to say red states and blue states, and to imagine that there is this kind of stark difference between people in one part of the country and people in another. A theme that Deb and I stressed again and again is how at the local level, people, regardless of political orientation, were much more practical minded, much less tribal, much more intent on finding some reasonable way to do things. And you see that quite clearly now in Sioux Falls in South Dakota. South Dakota for a long time, at least since the time of when Tom Daschle had been a senator there, from that time onward, it's been a very heavily Republican state. The governor there is a Republican, Kristi Noem, the former congressperson from South Dakota. The mayor of Sioux Falls, a man named Paul Tenhaken, also a Republican, conservative on the national view. But it's quite how at the state level, Governor Noem has made sure that South Dakota is one of just now a handful of states that's not having any shelter-at-home orders or other kinds of controls to mitigation controls. I guess it's probably only 5 or 6 states now, and South Dakota is resolutely one of those. But Mayor Tenhaken of Sioux Falls, again, a conservative Republican in this town, has been quite progressive, I'll say, in saying we have a real emergency in our community. Sioux Falls has become one of the hot spots. After New York and New Jersey, it's becoming now one of the concentrations because of this plant. And he's been doing everything he can to try within his community to protect the people. And I saw just before this call started, there was some new order he set out, which I haven't read yet, but it's just in general. The normal dividing lines of national politics really lose their explanatory power generally at the local level. And you see that in Sioux Falls, where most of the community leaders we've been talking with are seeing what they can do to try to protect their people, both the community of workers at the packing plant, who, like in most beef packing plants or meat packing plants, are largely immigrant, largely refugee, largely non-white, largely low wage, and a community that on the whole, that apart from them, is largely white, but protecting them and dealing with the medical reality. So if you see the name of Mayor Paul Tenhaken in Sioux Falls, recognize that he's trying to do what he can to protect his community.
Well, and Jim, just as a follow-up, I think one of the things that makes our town so special is the look at really what's happening on local levels and trying to call attention to the folks that are leading communities through this. After we, and I don't know what the timeline looks like, none of us do, but after we emerge from this and not necessarily return to normal, because I think we have an opportunity to go to something better, do you think more people now are going to pay attention more to what's happening locally than perhaps they were before? Do you think this is a real moment to key in on local leadership?
So Deb, can I start on that? So as you know, Ben, as we've discussed with you and with people in the area and around the country over the last 4 or 5, our main theme has been that at a time people in general are aware of the dysfunction of national level U.S. government, and regardless of their party affiliation, they recognize it's not a really great time in national government. We are saying, city by city, state by state, you do see this resurgent municipal leadership, nonprofit leadership, and all the rest. I think that the whole country has been immersed in a real-time and horrible but instructive demonstration of that reality right now, because we've had a catastrophic failure of national leadership, which I can illustrate most clearly this way. 1 month ago today, the U.S. and South Korea had about the same number of deaths from the virus. It was about in the mid-200s for both countries. In the U.S., very large, South Korea, smaller. 1 month ago, it was the same number of deaths. Now, South Korea has still in the 200s of deaths, and we're nearing 50,000. There is national level leadership in South Korea has contained things that has not happened here. We know all the variety of reasons. So people know that we're having a sort of national problem that has made the U.S. the hotspot for the world of this pandemic. And people have also seen mayors and governors and regional alliances like those in the Northeast and the Pacific Coast and the Upper Midwest, and now even in the South, finding ways to work together in regional alliances, nonprofit organizations, religious organizations. That's where the fabric of America has been demonstrating itself. So I think that people, while it hasn't really been focused on that much, I think it's being imprinted on people's minds that the saviors of America right now have Americans in their informal alliances, and the mayors they've elected and the governors they've elected, and lots of the local groups. And I hope that one of the positive effects of this terrible episode we're all going through now is some familiarity, and I've been saying some muscle memory of recognizing that this is how people can work in an even more dramatic way than chronically over years.
And to speak response to Deb, one of the pieces that I wanted to call folks' attention to that you've written talks about the second responders. And I know we talk a lot about first responders when it comes to the crisis, but you have such a wonderful observation about the second responders and how that applies to libraries. And, I know that that's a topic near and dear to your heart. That's what we brought you to the Jefferson for the first time, to talk about the future of libraries and how they're finding their footing in the 21st century. So tell us a little bit about your observations of the responses that you're seeing from libraries amongst this crisis.
Yeah, this has been so interesting. I've had a chance to be back in touch with a lot of the librarians in the places where we visited, and I've done reporting before. I'll add as an exception to that, I haven't made contact with your wonderful library in Glasgow, in Erie, and I know that you have new leadership there, so I'm really looking forward to talking with them as well. Around the country, the librarians have really stepped up, and what's interesting, both it's a continuum and yet it's a pivot. In the continuum, the librarians have always have be second responders after floods, after shootings, after riots, after you name it, awful thing that happened in a town. The libraries have stayed open and have welcomed people there as a safe haven and a place for activity and a place to kind of seek comfort and have a sense of normalcy. This time, all the libraries were also closed. So that's been an entirely new factor in how they have to operate. And the way that the libraries are pivoting to this new reality of everything, their doors are closed and they are having to they are both going online to do everything and figuring out ways to be in the community to do things as best they can has been really interesting. That the online pivots are a lot of what you'd expect. Storytime can go online, introducing people who go online to the libraries to all of the content that they have. Other things that are offline are also telling of how libraries work. Libraries strong in their collaborations with a lot of institutions or groups or organizations in the towns, one of them being schools. So whereas kids used to come into the library and get homework help after school in a lot of places, now all the schools are online, but not all the kids get to be online. So they have both ramped up to get Chromebooks and special internet connections so that more families can be online to access the schoolwork. Even that isn't working in a lot of places. So the schools and the libraries are working together to actually get homework to kids. The school buses will go around and drop off the real homework. Librarians will work with the teachers to call teachers to say who needs help with the homework, and take that once was inside the library tutorials for homework on the phone to kids who need to do it at home. So the librarians are really pivoting both in the real world, in the online world, in the telephone world, in all different ways they can figure out to do it. Another really strong collaboration is in food services. A lot of kids go to libraries after school for their snacks. They go there in the summertime to be fed in the programs. And once school was closed, the libraries realized, we've got a lot of food left over here. Let's collaborate with the schools and give them everything we've got to help them deliver it to the kids who need it. And they've been really creative in technological ways, realizing, for example, that a lot of libraries have 3D printers. So they're starting to make masks like other people in their, if you have a home 3D printer can make a mask. Hundreds and hundreds of them, thousands of them around the country are being made courtesy of the libraries and getting out into the hands of the people who do it. I was listening to one webcast today or the other day about librarians, and one of them said in this really touching way, she said, I have never been so proud of being a librarian as I am today, in just the expression of how librarians are figuring out ways to be creative and pivoting and having their first mission of serving the people top of what they do.
That's so amazing. hear, Deb. I mean, that's just and the creativity that we're seeing from that, from the school buses, deploying resources and dropping that off to the 3D printers, and just how libraries can adapt. And certainly thinking about the role they do and how they've moved. And so, if you wouldn't mind, share that webcast with me. I'll share it with the listeners, viewers to this program. I'll go ahead and put it in the comments section once we're finished. One of the things that it's hard to ignore that libraries have a lot of, and it's books. Jim, you have offered a great books of the moment write up on the website. And so why these books now? And once you're done explaining that, can I ask you to give us a little bit more homework in what we should be reading as we're all quarantining or self-isolating or staying in place?
Yes, so I'm trying to remember which books was I touting most recently. I can tell you what I'm reading now.
So tell us what you're reading now. We can go back to one of the books that I am eager to get a hold of is from a journalist from Charleston, West Virginia. You've taken a look at that. And
yes. So I'll tell you those two. One is a book called Midwest Futures by an author named Phil Chrisman, and he's based now in Michigan, but it's from a publishing house called Belt Publishing in Cleveland, whose whole ambition has been to establish the publishing imprint off the coast. And this book, Midwest Futures, is quite an interesting set of, the concept for it is that when the Midwest was laid out, it was in these grids of 6 mile by 6 mile grids with 36 mile square plats within them. So the book is organized in the same way with 6 rows and 6 little plats within each one. And so that I thought was quite interesting about how the Midwest is still, and I will count Erie as part of the extended Midwest in this concept.
We count ourselves there too.
It is sort of used as an object for whatever idea is on the mind of somebody in New York or DC or maybe Seattle, as opposed to a real place. So I thought that was something that was quite interesting. The other one was called Death in, it's by a guy named Eric Eyre, and it's Death in some little town, Death in some hollow or something, but it's a book, and it's about, this is from the person who broke the story of the opioid crisis in Appalachia. So Eric Mudleg. And so Eric was the person who found out 4 or 5 years ago. There was a little town of a couple thousand people in southwestern West Virginia processing millions of opioid prescriptions per year. And from that and the reporting he was doing for the Gazette-Mail in Charleston, he was able to, he sort of brought attention to this problem. He's responsible personally for a lot of legislation. He won the Pulitzer Prize. I was going to say bittersweet, just the sad part of, so the glorious part of this is that Eric Eyre's book is really wonderful, and it has sort of the if you're thinking of the old movie with Russell Crowe, The Insider, of finding the story of corporate misdeeds, he has all that narrative. Eric himself, as is no secret, has had Parkinson's disease for a number of years and is coping with that. Also, the newspaper he's working for, the Gazette-Mail in Charleston, has suffered all the challenges that newspapers around the country have. And so on the day his book was published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Eric also, that was his last day on the job with the newspaper. I think for a combination of the newspaper was reducing its footprint and he was having health problems. But he is a wonderful person. It's a wonderful book, and he is somebody who, in the great muckraking tradition, can claim to have shaped political history, shaped modern history by breaking the story on the opioid. So I think those are the 2 books that I was talking about then. I'm also, I have next to the bed another book with an Erie connection by my longtime friend, David Ignatius, who I know is part of the Jefferson Force Field 2. He's had a great successful career as a spy novelist. As a brand new one out called The Paladin, which I am ready to read as soon as I'm not reading about the woes of the country and the world.
We are excited for that. Maybe we can try to work to get David Ignatius featured here as well. We were so happy to have him as part of the Global Summit lineup at the Jefferson. I'm so happy to hear has a role in his new book, so excited for that. Deborah, are you reading anything? Any recommendations you have for people that now have a little bit more time on their hands and maybe want a little less screen time on their hands to pick up an actual book? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I'm reading this book, ironically, kind of. It's called Solitary, and it's by a man named Albert Woodfox. He's just the same age as Jim and I are, and he grew up in Louisiana. A really scary kid when he was young. Started to get into a lot of bad, petty criminal activity, which escalated. Blah blah blah. He's a black man. He ended up a number of times, but finally in the very infamous Angola prison in northern Louisiana. And that is one of the last places you want to be ever, even as an incarcerated person. He was framed for various crimes. I mean, he committed a lot of crimes, but he was framed for others and ended up in solitary confinement, which takes on a new meaning when you're sitting at home in your own house for a long time. Nothing like what he was doing, but nonetheless for decades. And it is the story of his life and going through this experience and finally coming out on the other side. He wrote this book unbelievably. It is so honest, simple, straightforward, moving, and really takes you into it in a way that there's not a cheap shot. It pulls no punches. It's just so totally honest that it's just shocking. I didn't expect to like it as much as I am. Jim and I happened to be at the Tucson Book Festival about a year ago, right, Jim? And he was also presenting there, so we met him too. And I must say it was a really kind of personally awkward experience. I felt to be in the presence of somebody who had spent essentially his whole life in the Angola prison and was now out and wrote this incredible book. It was really awkward. Like, how do you talk to someone like this? Jim, did you have that sense?
Yes, and I should say also that there's a connection. So the editor of this one book, which was for a number of prizes, I think it won some too, is the person who also was the American editor of Deb's wonderful book, Dreaming in Chinese, a man named George Gibson. And is he with Bloomsbury still, Deb, or with a different house now?
No.
But it's a different house, but he was a friend of ours. So we were, a year ago at this book festival in Tucson, which is a huge event. And there was one other of George Gibson's authors who were there at dinner. And so it was, as Deb said, surreal that four of the people at the table, George Gibson, the editor, his other author, Deb and me, were all on the book tour circuit and all that. And this Albert Woodfox was out of decades in Angola prison. And so I thought he was a very formidable person, and it is also a very powerful book. I have one other to add, Deb, to the list after you've explained this. So this will sound like a cliche, but it's actually worth your listeners going back and reading, which is The Plague by Albert Camus. I had read this, eons ago. I read it in French class, and I read it sometime in graduate school. It's actually worth reading. It's not that long. It's only about 200 pages long, so it's a relatively quick read. And while it is different, talking about the bubonic plague in Algeria in the 1940s, it also, you can see a lot of similarities in the way people react, in the sense of contagion, in your personal distance from other people, in denial and acceptance. So I think spending an evening reading The Plague is worth it. It's in the category of books everybody says, oh yeah, I've read that, I've heard of it. I hadn't read it for 30 years, and it's worth actually looking at again.
Those are terrific recommendations. Aside from books, any really quickly, you can rattle them off and we'll go to some political questions, but any podcasts you're recommending, any music you're streaming, playlists you've put together, things you're listening to survive the shutdown, the quarantine, the stay-in-place self-isolation?
I have a weird answer for that, which is I feel like there is so much incoming every minute of the day and every day running into the next that I just need to get away from even beautiful, even terrible noise. I'm someone who liked to listen really closely to whatever is right here for me. So I've actually been enjoying, when we can, opening the windows and listening to the birds in the morning. And I'm listening to them with a new kind of urgency, and how they talk to each other, and they actually do. I mean, things that I know were out there, but it's the nature sounds, believe it or not, which is, the next best thing to silence. It's part of silence that I have really enjoyed more than turning on the radio or music, which seems like more of an obligation now than it is a pleasure.
Well, and that's such a wonderful observation, especially with what we were noting in this conversation as we navigated through a couple of technical hiccups, the return of nature into public space, and especially urban space. So that's wonderful. Jim, are you listening to the birds as well? Do you have other recommendations?
So I will have an observation and a recommendation. So I think in a way the hardest thing about the last 6 weeks now for Deb has not simply been my omnipresence in her life, but it's that Deb, through all of the years, the decades we've been together, almost every single day you have gone swimming. Wherever we are, you have gone swimming, and you can't do that. And I think that is an hour of your life when you're just immersed, and in literal and symbolic sense too, and you can't do that. So you do this streamed yoga from the yoga school, a substitute. My recommendation is there's a series that I think Deb and I can't recommend highly enough. It's called Borgen, Borgen. It sounds really implausible. It's 7 or 8 years old. It's essentially House of Cards or other, the West Wing, but set in the Danish Parliament. And you couldn't suggest anything to me that I would be less interested in than the Danish Parliament. But it is really fabulous. And I think it's on either Amazon Prime or something. There's 3 seasons, 10 episodes each. But Deb, would you agree watching Borgen was a reward of the last time of immersion here?
It really is. And it has subtitles, but they're, you kind of learn Danish along the way, because it's not really that different from English. So by the end, you've also picked up a little Danish, and you're in the middle of this really complicated home situation of the family characters and watching them go through it. And in a way, what happens in Borgen is such an intense situation that even though it's not at all similar to being in a pandemic, just watching the characters go through such an intense experience makes you think, it makes you closer to that experience because of what we're all feeling right now. And also about the swimming, I realized what a kind of first world problem is that is. Poor Deb can't swim, but everybody has something like that you kind of don't even want to say out loud, but it's your difficult thing.
Well, and 2 things on that, Deb. One, I think that is critical for our viewers here to be reminded of or to be introduced to if they didn't have the Our Towns or the City Makers American Futures Project experience. One of the ways that you discover places is going to public pools. And so you often find yourself in YMCAs of towns and cities and the metros that you're visiting. And it's such beautiful writing, because I don't think that many of us often think of that as a public space where we're bumping into people and getting to know a community and experiencing that. And you were so absolutely right. We were all missing our one thing that we realized was a huge part of our life before, but now realized what a big piece it is now. And it sounds like a great opportunity to get away from American politics to take a look at Danish politics for a second. I do have some politics questions that I want to rattle through with the 2 of you while I do have you here. But the final Our Towns question, I'm just really curious about. So first, congratulations on the news. You're getting the plane back. And you're able to go from place to place to place as soon as all of this is over and we are through the crisis. But if you, assuming that we had the time to train them and they can become pilots and co-pilots, who would you choose to send on your journey through Our Towns? Because you would be interested in hearing their perspective and their reporting to see what they see from the places that you've been to. Of all the folks that you could choose from, who do you pick?
Deb, I will let you go first.
I have to go answer the door. You do that.
Oh, sure. So if there was somebody at the door, I would have heard it too.
I was going to say, Jim is Deb, so there's doorbell capabilities in your room.
So she is one floor closer to the front door than I am. So yeah, she is answering the door. I guess I would. It would be useful if we could have anybody in a position of national leadership get out on their. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of somebody. If you think of whoever is your most, choose whoever is your most esteemed novelist of this moment, who is based either in Berkeley or Brooklyn or Boston or someplace like that, or Adams Morgan in DC, and or also the Iowa Writers Workshop, and you'd like to have this person be exposed instead to Tulsa or to Erie or to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, or to name your other 100 places. I would like to have novelists who, if what Philip Roth did for Newark,
yes,
or John Updike for suburban Philly,
yes,
I'd like to have either of those. If we could bring them both back from the dead and put them in the back seat of the plane, I would take them.
Okay, I have to tell you, there really was someone at the door. It was a neighbor who was dropping off hand sanitizer.
Oh,
yes, that sounds real likely.
I never thought you'd hear those words coming from my mouth.
So Deb, who do you want to have in the plane?
Okay, you know what? This is weird, but I would choose someone with one condition. I would choose Tom Hanks, but he had to go everywhere and no one would recognize him. He'd be completely, incognito, because I think he's a really sensitive observer and good person, and would have a lot to see. But the deal is he'd have to, be wearing a face mask or something so nobody could recognize who he was.
And in the other seat, we have 4 places in the plane, would be Meryl Streep, also incognito, right?
That sounds like an amazing plane ride. I know what we're going to try to put after we get off of this call. I did say, Paul, Jim, I've got to ask, you brought back the time capsules on the Atlantic's website. That was such important and dense, heavy coverage you did through the 2016 election. They are back. Why bring them back?
This is a question that editors of the magazine have asked me as well.
And what did you tell them?
In a cognitive, not dissonance, but contrast way, I get a ton of mail from people saying, "Oh, we're so glad to see this back." I think often my colleagues, The Atlantic, would prefer me to be doing sort of standalone stories, chapter 9,000 on what's wrong with the current administration. To me, I think there is value in recording what we know as we learn it and before we know how things are going to turn out. So in these 150 odd installments I did in the 2016 campaign, the leitmotif was nobody knows how this election is going to come out. Nobody even knew how the primary is going to come out when I started this. And what do people know about the stakes, about the candidates, about the issues, about the emotions while it's happening? And I thought that something like that was worth doing now, because in the just fire hose of news every second, you forget that 3 or 4 days ago from the White House, the serving president of the United States was essentially urging people to rise up against the governors of states and the governors who are implementing the policy that his own administration was advocating. So I think it's because I just thought it was worth sort of laying down pipe. People would want to know what it was like in this time people will look back on, and I want to record what people know so it's not forgotten.
And so when it comes to the 2020 election, I think that's such a great service as we move through. And I think that harkens back to what Deb said earlier, that I think has been even more exacerbated as we find ourselves in COVID-19, is just this flood of information, overwhelmed. And so it's such a great tool to go back to and observe. Deb, when it comes to 2020 election, what is the one thing we, and I put we in air quotes here, we are not talking about, but we should be?
Well, the thing I'm most worried about right now is that the election will, that the voting will actually happen and happen fairly. I know, people have started to talk about that a little bit, but I sure hope somebody's preparing for that day when people go to the polls or mail in their ballots. That's just what's on my mind of the next kind of terrible risk of something that might go wrong that we as individuals can't really control.
Jim, for you, what's the one thing that we're not talking about but should be? And it can be the same answer.
Yeah. So I agree with Deb that the election actually happen is of first order importance. What's strange is that almost anything we talk about in the next 2 or 3 months, or how long is it till the election, 6+ months, probably will have no bearing whatsoever on what whoever's in office, after January will have to actually do, because the economic predicament we're heading into is unprecedented. The scale will be like the Great Depression in certain ways, but different, of course. And dealing with China is going to be different. There's a million things that will be different. And I think almost nothing that anybody says in campaign speeches is going to really affect what is done in office. I can say what he is in office because it'll be either Trump or Biden. I think there is a consciousness on both sides that really all that matters to either side is the person they are supporting and the party they are supporting. So I think there probably will not be presidential debates this year. And in a way that probably is better, because I think most people in the U.S. know as much as they need to know already about how they're going to vote. I think if there were a vote today, the outcome would probably be pretty similar to what it would be 6 months from now, which is different from a whole lot of campaigns before. So I wish that there were speeches on how to deal with small business, what's the right approach to China, and education equity. We could spend the next 5 hours saying, here's what people should talk about. But nihilistically, but realistically, I think it doesn't matter. What matters is essentially the party and the candidate that people are lining up behind.
Do you think that this is does this have an element of stickiness, or is this just a blot in our timeline? Will we return to the way politics has been before? Will we emerge differently, or has this permanently fractured the country? I know that that's a tough question, but from both your observations of people that have seen so much of the country, and so many of us haven't, are we permanently apart?
So I will give you, of course, a yes and no, yes and yes, everything is simultaneously true kind of answer, because one of my guiding principles is anything interesting is inherently contradictory. Anything important is inherently contradictory. So I think there are things that probably are changed for the long run and things where rebound is possible. Because Deb and I have been around for such a long time now, we've seen a lot of really bad times in the U.S. We were in college during the late stages of the Vietnam War, which was a catastrophic time. The year of 1968 was still the worst year in modern American history, at least in our lifetimes. 2020 might overtake it, but it hasn't yet. There were assassinations and just riots all across the country, et cetera. So we've seen the U.S., after all the trauma of the Vietnam years, after the huge economic dislocation of the 1970s, after the huge economic dislocation 15 years ago and a dozen years ago, there's been another one of my principles is the U.S. is always in trouble. And the question is how the getting out of trouble forces balance with the in trouble forces. So we've been in bad times before, and that is part of America's predicament. On the other hand, Donald Trump, I think, has changed the Republican Party, I believe, in a lasting way. Speaking as somebody who once worked for a Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, long ago, I believe that the real story of the last 4 years is that so few elected Republicans have resisted anything was done. I think Trump has not surprised me with anything he has done. The people who have surprised me are 53 Republican senators, or 52 minus Mitt Romney, who have not stood up against it. And I think that is a lasting change for the Republican Party. That's part of why I want to chronicle this while it is happening, so they can't say, oh, we didn't know what was going on. So that is my pitch. Deb, your pitch.
My pitch is that, so I've been thinking about this in our family that we're in touch with now every day, everyone. The age range is from my 98-year-old mother to our 1.5-year-old granddaughter. So we've got almost an entire century of people who are living through this experience now. And I've just been thinking how it will mark every one of our family, and how it will mark everyone who's living through this in some enormous way and in some different way, depending on how old they are. Our 8-year-old grandson absorbs everything about what is going on now, and it has to, take away some of the stars in his eyes of how perfect his little life is, to seeing such a complex bad thing happen. And but it will make him smarter and stronger and more appreciative and better, I think, because of it. Same thing with kids who are graduating from college in next month and looking for jobs. And same thing with those who want to get married next month and are putting off, or people who are losing their jobs and their families. Or my mom, who was, talking with her this morning about the Depression, and she was telling me about how people would come to their back step, and her mother always had food for them. She always fed them on the porch, but she would make tons of extra food for anybody who came by in the Depression.
And you should say what this is for your mom, what today is for your mom.
Oh, today, okay, I'm gonna.
So 75 years ago today, Deb's mother and father were married. When Deb's father was then a submariner, he was a naval officer. He had a week's leave in April of 1945, and they went home to Chicago. Were married. He is no longer with us, but Deb's mom Angie is still. So happy 75th anniversary to Frank and Angie Zaret.
Oh my
Chicago.
gosh, that's such a beautiful and amazing thing. Congratulations to her, and what a memory you keep alive for both of them, Deb. And being able to tell her story and manage the Depression with her mother, and what that looked like. I don't know if either of you are certified to perform weddings, speaking of those, but I know that there are big calls out for folks to deliver commencement addresses. I'd like to publicly challenge both of you to offer your commencement addresses in a time like this for the seniors who don't get to have their graduation. I think your two messages would be fantastic for any of the schools out there who desperately need them to hear them. So I know we're all trying to do our part through this. You two have been so gracious with your time and spent a lot of time with me, and I don't want to take up too much more of it. One of the things that we did talk about earlier that I said I'd circle back to, and I'd be remiss if I didn't, is the impact of COVID-19 on journalism and what the future of journalism looks like. And you're two of the best in the business, and you get to tell the stories of a lot of journalists and what's happening. So if I just started the sentence and asked you to finish it, I'd say the future of journalism post-COVID-19 is...
My ending of the sentence would be challenging as it has always been. And what I'm saying there is, on the one hand, the crisis of local news, which has been 20 years in the making and probably 5 years, the most acute, making the last 20 years because of the shift of advertising towards Google and Facebook, last 4 or 5 years because of the shift of ownership models to private equity and hedge funds. That's been a long brewing crisis for local news. In the last months, local news has been local is if nightclubs aren't opening, if restaurants aren't opening, if movie theaters aren't opening, they can't advertise. And so that is really acute crisis for local news now. On the other hand, the attention to news is greater now than it's ever been before. You know, the Atlantic is living through both parts of this. The audience for what we put online about the virus and other things every day is twice as large now as it was even 2 months ago. You know, it's just, there's huge audience for what we're doing, even as advertising is melting away. So I think that there will be the function we're all providing. Your time, Ben, with the Erie Reader and just people who are involved in journalism, what we're all doing is necessary, and all the more so right now. The economic underpinnings are being shot out from beneath us in a newly aggressive way. I think that the history of journalism is continuing to create economic underpinnings, and there will be people thinking about how to do that, as they will with local businesses and everything else. So it is a moment of crisis for journalism and a moment of opportunity. And I see so many young people who are reporting, exploring, explaining, podcasting, doing videos. The supply of great idealistic talent is there, and I believe they will work to find a way to sustain their activity economically too.
Deb, for you, future journalism, what does it look like?
I think it will attract a lot more people into the profession, the same way that there will be more doctors, there will be more teachers, there will be more librarians, there may not be more grocery workers, there will be more policemen, there will be more journalists, because people are seeing that these are noble professions of serving the people, of doing good, and I think just like a core of the mission of all of these different professions will maybe become more important to more young people who are going into professions. It'll be, a positive trend of things happening.
So my parting question for two people who have frequently been going from place to place, country, continent to continent, here you are with the rest of us, homebound. So when the orders are lifted and when we feel safe and when we feel comfortable to travel again, where are you two headed first? And do not feel obligated to say Erie. In fact, I'll say other than Erie, Pennsylvania, where are the two of you going to head first?
Deb, you can lead off. I think I know what you'll say, but you can lead off.
Well, oddly, I am not at all eager to go anywhere. We've been moving around so much that with some guilt, I say that we're really happy to be at home. It is a novel experience for us right now to be at home. If you made me go somewhere, the next place I would actually go, believe it or not, is on a cruise ship. Really
What? You're kidding.
Because I'm back into the nature. I miss my water, I miss the air, I miss the silence, and I would pick a really good boat, a small one, with a lot of protective PPEs and things like that. That's where I'm going. Sorry.
So the last place we were before the lockdown was actually Antarctica. We were there for quite a while with some people who have a boat that was capable of going there. Deb, you will recognize when I say the next two places where I feel we need to go are Dallas and Santa Barbara.
Sure.
Because one of our sons and his family live in Dallas, the other of our son and his family live in Santa Barbara. We're having Zoom with his families, but we have not seen them. But I think in contrast to Deb, as Deb misses swimming, I miss going new places. I miss being in Hattiesburg. or being in Tulsa, or being in Moline, or being wherever. So we'll find the harmonic balance of working this out as we have over the decades.
Yeah, this won't rip us apart.
What a wonderful thing to dream about and to plan. I know there were some of the comments in the section, some of the questions have been fed to me. Thank you all for doing that. One of those did note, Deb, as you mentioned, your corn snack has been important. He gave a shout out to the popcorn company in South Bend, Indiana for the flavored popcorn there. So folks, leave all of your recommendations. We'll share those with the Fallows, and I will share the things I promised during this video. James and Deborah Fallows, authors of the best-selling Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America, and astute observers of America and beyond. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this Jefferson program today.
Thank you, Ben. We're honored to join you.
Great.
And a big thanks to all of you watching along at home. Thank you for tuning in. To find out more information about upcoming programming and publications from the Jefferson, tune in to www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for the Jefferson Educational Society. I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.